Rain had already turned the red earth to clinging clay when Akin heard the cough that meant trouble. A woman's breath, ragged and sudden in the back of a crowded danfo, the kind of cough that could mean collapse or worse, in a city where health is a coin most people cannot afford. If he did nothing, the pregnant stranger might lose her child on the bus. If he did something, he risked the attention of the bus conductor and the men who like to kick street children farther into the gutters. What would a homeless orphan's courage be worth against a city's indifference, and who, if anyone, would ever know? A faint glint of a black SUV had passed them earlier, a shadow of wealth on Lagos's pothole-strewn spine, and for the first time, Akin wondered whether the richest people ever notice the poor, or only step over them on their way to towers of glass. The question felt urgent as the woman's water began to break, and the danfo jolted into a pothole. He reached out before he had decided, hands shaking but steady, and when the bus lurched, he pulled her down to lay on his old sweater, unaware that eyes behind tinted windows were watching. What happened next would change the direction of every life in that crooked street. Akin's world had always been small and stubborn. A corrugated roof he shared with 3 other boys by Ajagunle Market, the rhythm of mornings where the generator hummed and sellers shouted over the market bustle, and the itch of harmattan breath that came like a warning in December. He was a homeless orphan who could name every roof that leaked in a 3-kilometer radius, who could patch a torn sandal with shoe glue as easily as he could recite the prayer mothers said at the church courtyard when the rains held back the sky. He kept 2 treasures, a tin cup and a picture of a woman whose face he could not quite remember, and the rule he lived by, never take one else's food unless a smaller mouth needed it more, never look away when a stranger fell. The pregnant stranger in the danfo smelled of expensive perfume and panic, and Akin's heart, used to the small mercies of street living, beat as if he had been called to something larger than himself. The inciting violence was not only the city's indifference. As Akin lifted the woman from the seat, the conductor hissed, a chorus of voices rose, and someone shouted for the bus to stop at the church courtyard, the only place open late where a janitor might summon help. The pregnant stranger clutched Akin's sleeve and whispered, "Please," like a prayer, and the bus spilled them into the yellow light of the courtyard, where mosquitoes hunted the warmth of skin and the church lights painted halos over cracked tiles. Akin, who had learned to barter his small kindnesses for a warm place to sleep, now felt raw responsibility. If he could not find help, the child might be born in the gutter, and the world would not blink. He pounded at the locked door until a tired deacon answered with suspicion, and a hush fell that smelled of wax and a coming storm. Then a white van idled at the road, and a man with a camera laughed as if this were entertainment, and Akin had to decide who to trust. Troubles tightened like a noose from there. First, the medical clinic at the market said they could not take an emergency without money. The deacon offered a cup of tea and a prayer, but no ambulance. Then, the conductor demanded fare for the whole seating, and a small boy who owed Akin bread earlier came running with a note. A man named Sade had promised a job if Akin brought a human interest story to her phone, and Sade seemed like a friend in a city that kept friends at arm's length. He followed the note's promise because hunger yet again overreached caution, and the wolf in sheep's clothing arrived, wearing a bright smile and a camera that smelled of varnished lenses, talking about how rescuing a pregnant stranger could make a viral story and lift them both out of misery. Akin handed his tin cup reluctantly to the man with the camera so the woman could get proper attention, hoping the air would suddenly taste of rescue. Instead, the camera clicked, and Sade's grin stayed too long. What would be the price of that image? They huddled in a clinic that smelled of disinfectant and boiled rice, and by the time the midwife shook her head and said, "No payment, no service," the world had drawn a line through Akin's plans, because the money the deacon scraped together was barely a scruple, and the conductor had already put Akin's name and face on a list for the next morning's sweep. Sade promised to post the video of the rescue, Not just a plea, but a pitch to the city's heart, with captions about miracle on Ajagunle Road, and Akin felt something twist inside him. Relief, hand in glove with an unfamiliar fear that the spotlight might burn him. On the clinic's cracked cot, the pregnant stranger squeezed his hand and said, "You're not alone," but Akin, who had learned to count on nothing, wondered if a stranger's thanks would be traded for coins in someone else's ledger. Danfo's horn seemed to sound from somewhere far away. How much would the city demand when it finally noticed them? Pattern interrupt. 3 days later, the market smelled of roasted plantain and diesel, and the city announced that the shanties along the road would be cleared to make way for a glossy development. Bulldozers had a timetable, and the municipal notice said, "By dawn, the shacks must be gone." Akin woke with rain on his thin blanket and the image of the pregnant woman in the clinic's pale light. He had promised to look after a small boy named Jeed who had been sleeping in the next hut, and if dawn came and they had nowhere to go, children would scatter like ants. The threat of demolition moved like a shadow, and every plan Akin had, whose worth was measured in borrowed ropes and promises scrawled on napkins, looked smaller. Sade's video went up, and the city turned a curious eye. But a curious eye does not feed a child or stop a bulldozer. Would the online pity buy time or trade them for spectacle? A second pattern interrupt shook them an afternoon later when a woman in a black SUV, tinted glass, the kind that swallowed faces, pulled up at Ajagunle Market and stepped out under the guffaws of shoppers, her shoes clicking on the wet pavement, while a guard with a radio kept his face as blank as a ledger. She moved through the market with braids swinging, and though Akin could not place how she smelled, something like rain and new leather, she seemed to carry a calm that silenced even hawkers' calls for a moment. The pregnant stranger had been quiet the day Sade posted the video, but now Akin spotted her watching from a stall, hands folded like a queen who had not yet declared a rule, and for the first time the city's gulf felt less absolute. Was she merely another passerby or something else? The woman's gaze found Akin and held it, and in that long-held Ka was an invitation he had not been taught to accept. Escalation continued the next night when a group of municipal workers came to the shanties with orders: leave by dawn or be removed. Chief Balogan, the developer with a private iron-voiced lawyer and a parade of SUVs, had plans for a shopping mall that would glitter where they slept, and his men spoke of progress in tones that made Akin want to vomit. Jide's eyes filled with terror when they said the children would be separated and placed in reform homes, and Akin, who could not produce a single paper to prove his right to exist, felt his throat close. Sade showed up like a vulture with brightness and a camera, promising to intervene if Akin performed, and he nearly agreed, because the bulldozer's growl had already begun on the next street. Would he trade his dignity for shelter and a place to eat? Then the wolf's teeth bared. Sade's video, edited to show Akin as a pitiable hero, made him a subject of headlines that kindled both charity and contempt, and a local politician used the footage to accuse street children of staging stunts to extort cash. The charity that once promised to take Akin in sent forms that required signatures and references, and the deacon's name was crossed off because the church feared legal entanglements. Chief Balogan's lawyer wrote a letter accusing the children of trespassing on a security zone, and the police were already marking those they would remove first. Akin felt betrayal like a cold hand. Sade, who had looked like a helper, had not understood that headlines bite and then discard, and she left with a flourish while he stayed in the dust. The sky threatened thunder. Where could he run when the city had decided they were invisible? On a desperate night, when the rain had stopped, but the earth still smelled of wet iron and tobacco smoke from a neighbor's small fire, Akin made the choice that would ripple like a drumbeat. He carried the pregnant stranger who had collapsed again behind the market stalls to the church courtyard and shared his only blanket with her, trading his warmth for the woman's shivering body, even though his scalp prickled with the possibility that the upcoming demolition would sweep them both out. He did not do it for cameras or favor. He did it because a promise had been whispered in his head since he was a child. Do not pass a suffering person without lifting them. The woman opened her eyes, and for the first time spoke more than a please. "You have a good heart, boy," she said, and the way she said it felt like a name given rather than a judgment spoken. Unknown to Akin, a discreet man in a dark suit across the courtyard, an aide who liked to solve problems before they escalated, watched the exchange and sent a single message into a phone the color of midnight. That small act of kindness, done in the earth-scented dark, would not be forgotten. Pressure tightened. The demolition order named a day. By dawn on Monday the shacks would be cleared, families relocated only to temporary settlements miles away without running water, and the children would be split between foster homes at the council's discretion. Jide's mother, who had been taken by fever years ago, left a letter that was nothing more than ink and love. Akin read it at night and promised himself he would find a way to keep the group together. The city's legal notice meant that documents had to be produced, and without a birth certificate or a claim to any address, Akin faced the real possibility of being drafted into an orphanage system that made him small in different ways. Sade's peace had stirred patrons, yes, but it had also made Chief Balogan impatient to clear eyesore before the investors arrived, and the green lights atop their SUVs seemed to blink faster. Could they afford to wait for goodwill? Out in a city that sold time to the highest bidder. Time squeezed like a fist. Municipal officials set a meeting for Friday to discuss rehabilitation. The midwife warned that the pregnant stranger could deliver at any time. And on Saturday morning, a team of men with measuring tapes arrived to mark the ground where housings would be torn down. The court process that might stall the demolition would take months, and there was no lawyer with a free smile who would fight without fee, and the children whispered about sleeping on buses and traveling to places they had never seen. Akin counted down the hours with Jide curled against his side, feeling the city's clock hammer away the next chances, and thought about the black SUV he had seen weeks earlier and the man who had watched from the courtyard. He reasoned that there was no such thing as luck, only choices. But could one boy's choice bend the arm of a city made of glass and contracts? At the story's midpoint, when hope felt scarce and the bulldozer engine's cough seemed to be the city's new heartbeat, the pregnant stranger stood in the church courtyard before a crowd that had gathered in curiosity and breaking bread, and in a voice that belonged to a woman who had sat in boardrooms and heard the word no and still changed it into yes. She removed her scarf and said, "My name is Folashada Eze, and I own Eze Holdings." The revelation cracked the sky like thunder. A billionaire, the woman revealed, had been cradled in a boy's sweater and treated like any other human being, and that fact reframed the whole journey in an instant. Banks and investors do not usually bend to the rescue of the poor, but Folashada's face, lined with the exhaustion of a woman who had chosen to travel without entourages, made the nameless faces of the shanties into something her law could not ignore. The courtyard went silent as if the river had been stopped. And suddenly Akin had to choose how to let fate change him, demand payment for his deeds or ask for justice for all he had left behind. When the darkest moment came, it was not a sudden blow but the weariness of realization. Sade's viral fame had been repackaged as a spectacle by Chief Balogan's lawyer to claim that Akin had staged events for financial gain, and a judge could easily grant a clearance order if the story of exploitation stuck. The children faced being divided and relocated, their small lives scattered like the shells of cola nuts on the ground. Akin could have taken Folashad's initial offer to place the children in a comfortable shelter and cut a deal that would exempt him from responsibility, but standing in the dank church courtyard with rain-slicked hair and Jide's small hand in his, he remembered his mother's line about not turning away a suffering thing. He refused to sign a paper that would let the bulldozer roll and break other lives in the name of convenience, choosing instead the harder path. He would stand in public and tell the truth about Sadeh's edits and Chief Balogan's threats, even if it meant he lost any chance of personal comfort. The choice cost him sleep and the promise of immediate safety, but it kept the seed of his humanity alive. The confrontation came like a court scene played out in the market square where the city's people gathered. Folashade used her influence not to hush Akin's testimony, but to amplify it, leasing the market loudspeakers and calling out the contradictions in Chief Balogan's permits, while the man with the varnished camera, Sadeh, was confronted by his own footage, unedited clips pulled anonymously from bystanders to show his sly cuts and profitable lies. On screen, the truth landed like rain. Sadeh's edits had obscured the clinic's refusal of service. The lawyer's letter surfaced with a smear campaign underlining Balogan's plan, and the presence of cameras from Folashade's team recorded municipal officers accepting envelopes, evidence that could not be swept into a ditch. Chief Balogan sputtered threats and attempted to threaten witnesses, but corporate and legal advisors hired by Folashade acted quickly, freezing the demolition order and filing a complaint that put Balogan under investigation for bribery and fraud. The crowd, which had once muttered that no one ever helped them, now roared like a living tide as police officers took statements, and Balogan's lawyer watched his suits wrinkle with worry. Justice, this time, felt like a heavy but true thing landing on the market. The climax closed with clean visual beats. An armored corporate vehicle was driven away under escort, while the bulldozer, its blade still, rested like a beached fish. Akin stood on a crate with Jide at his side and told the assembled people what had happened, naming Sadeh's betrayal, Balogan's corruption, and his own choice to protect the children. Folashade put a steady hand on his shoulder and, speaking softer than the microphones, said, "We will rebuild what you have lost and give you more than shelter, education, training, and legal protection." Balogan's empire of exploitative contracts began to fray as the council opened a formal inquiry, and his bank accounts were examined by auditors that smelled of lemon and efficient worry. The moment justice landed was not theatrical. Officers filed forms, lawyers scratched notes, but the consequence was visible. A chain of keys handed over to the community committee, a notice halting the mall, and a camera that finally showed the truth. That resolution that followed, the red earth where shacks had once leaned, became the site of a community center paid for by Folashade's foundation, its opening celebrated with jollof rice steaming under awnings and children running barefoot across newly flattened ground that no longer threatened to swallow their dreams. Akin, who had been a homeless orphan with a tin cup, became guardian of a small learning room where he taught Jide and others how to read the names on bus routes and how to fix a broken radio. Folashade insisted he lead the center's youth program because she had seen his hands choose to help before choosing self. Chief Balogan faced legal consequences that stripped him of the property rights built on coercion. Said lost her platform when donors withdrew support after her deceit was exposed, and she was obliged to help run workshops about ethical journalism as part of restitution. The contrast was glaring and kind. Once Akin had ducked beneath danfo horns and generator hums, now he stood greeted by cars that smelled of new leather and a woman in a crisp suit who greeted him by name. The new normal was not instant wealth or a sudden erasure of old wounds, but it was tangible and steady. The community center had a solar panel that hummed like a generator refusing to die. The market stalls were safer and fed into microloans administered transparently. Children who once feared the council now learned bookkeeping, and Akin slept under a proper tin roof without the scrape of rats in the ceiling. Folashade arranged for the children to receive scholarships and legal identity papers, so no orphan could be erased by a bulldozer's timetable again, and she hired local staff who had once worked the stalls to run training courses. Akin visited the place where he had once slept to show the boys that their lives could bend. He had not become a billionaire. He had become something steadier, a steward of a small revolution. He still smelled the red earth in his clothes, and sometimes at dusk he would sit at the church courtyard and remember a black SUV, a phone message that had changed a life, and the midwife's face that had believed in him. Kindness planted in dark soil will grow in ways you cannot calculate, and the story of a homeless orphan who saved a pregnant stranger reminds us that courage is a currency even the richest cannot mint on their own. Never assume someone's worth by the chapter you see. The truth takes its own time to arrive, and when it does, it can topple empires built on silence. When the poor choose dignity and the powerful choose justice, a city's balance can swing towards something kinder. If this tale moved you, tell us in the comments about a time a small kindness made a big difference where you live. Subscribe for more folk tales from across Africa, like and share if you believe kindness matters, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. There are more lives to meet and more evenings to fill with listening. At dawn, the market's tin roofs glowed like coins left to shine in a long night, and the interval beat, this time a revealed truth that moved with the quiet weight of a drum, landed on Ajagunle with the elegance of a storm breaking. Folashade stepped onto a makeshift stage in the church courtyard, sleeves rolled up, a calm that belongs to someone who has weighed many fates and chosen one, and announced, not as a rumor but as a policy, that she was not a distant donor but a partner in a long apprenticeship with the city's heart. Ise Holdings would convert the plaza into a permanent community center, buy the shack's land through a transparent lease, fund full-time teachers, health workers, and a council of elders, and, most startling to Akin, she named him Youth Guardian, a role that would let him guide and guard the children without selling their stories to the highest bidder. The crowd's murmur rose to a new chorus. The pregnant woman Folashade had once sheltered, now named Folake, lifted her chin as if to bless the moment, while Akin felt the old ache of the night's hunger soften into something like a promise, a line drawn in the clay that would not wash away, and he whispered to Jeed, who clung to his leg, "We're not done yet," because the city's hunger never sleeps, and neither do hungry hearts. The interval's twist was not merely a speech, but a rebuke to every stone-faced man who believed that a single rescue could be bottled into a headline and left to evaporate. For Folashad's open declaration reframed what a rescue could become, a sustained partnership that would shield the vulnerable and bind the powerful to accountability. And the moment unsettled the room's moral gravity in the same breath that it filled the room with a transparency that felt unfamiliar, almost sacred, like a river suddenly unblocked. And yet, the first ripple of resistance was already gathering. Balagun's lawyers, who had watched through the side windows of the market with the patience of men counting pennies, rose to challenge the very word permanent, insisting that a building deal needs permits, numbers, and a chain of signatures, and that a village's dream cannot stand on a rumor of generosity alone. So the clock began to tick again, not toward another siege, but toward a public demonstration of faith and finance. Akin's throat tightened as if a hand had pressed against the back of his neck, reminding him that the dawn could also bring a deeper dusk if the old orders refused to bend. And he asked Folashade, with a stubborn tremor he could not quite hide, "What if they return with the bulldozers and the letters and the police?" And she answered with the simplest doctrine a person can offer in a city built from promises, "Then we stand taller, louder, together." The second beat followed quickly, and it carried a weight that felt almost medicinal. A deed, already drafted and stamped in the light of day, showing the transfer of the contested ground into a trust held by a city community committee, with Folashade's foundation supplying seed money and monthly grants for maintenance, salaries, and education, all numbers written to be legible to a child who would someday sign his name on the center's ledger. The arithmetic of care stood in contrast to the arithmetic of pressure that had rained down on the market for months, and Akin felt the room shift as if the earth itself exhaled. His own hands trembled not from fear, but from the insistence that a life on the street could be reorganized into a life that had a future laminated to a wall of classrooms and a hall of listening ears. "You can build a future," Folake whispered from the crowd, the phrase a soft bell in the noise, and Akin finally allowed himself a small, tired smile that felt like a map he could trust. But even as the papers were laid on a table for public viewing, a troubling shadow peeled from the corner. Sade's edited clips, the ones that had made a hero out of a boy who had fed a stranger, reappeared on devices the crowd had forgotten to mute, and the video's new caption claimed that the rescue was a staged performance designed to draw donors and a grateful press, a reminder that the city's appetite for proof could devour the truth if left to the wind. In that moment, the interval beat sharpened into a blade of doubt. Would Folashaide's magnanimity survive the second storm? And would the center survive the real test? Whether the community would trust a donated space enough to make its own laws there, or simply watch as the city's old rulers tried to rename the rescue as a spectacle to be sold back to them. 2 days later, that question found its first answer in the field of the daily grind. A weekly assembly in the old market square, where the air tasted of frying plantain and rain had left a slick gloss on the concrete, and where the town's past and future lined up like drums and dancers, each step a claim to belonging. Akin stood with Jeed and Folashaide's quiet envoy, a lanky lawyer named Anedi, whose eyes asked fewer questions than they answered with a firm tilt of her head, and the crowd pressed in, hungry for news, hungry for justice, hungry for the quiet relief that comes when wrongs are named aloud. The town hall's big projector flickered to life and showed a side-by-side of the old plans and the new covenant, a chart of the community's needs and the foundation's commitments. And as Nettie spoke with a voice that could cut through fear, Balogun's name rose in a chorus of booing that reminded everyone of the power that had once strutted through the market's shadows with a clipboard and a smile that did not reach the eyes. The room's electricity rose in a wave when a witness, Kemi, the bystander who had recorded the original rescue and who now wore a badge of courage that looked strange on a market stall, stepped into the frame and testified that the rescue was real, that the threat of eviction did not produce a hero but a necessity, that Sade's edits had bent the truth toward profit but could not hold when confronted by a crowd that was tired of being used. And then the twist along the edge of a blade. The footage Kemi carried was not just a weapon against Saad's deceit, but a key to Balogun's schemes, showing a pattern of payments, favors, and logistics that connected the market to a line of development deals with prices described in whispers and signatures, hidden within a bank's vault. And as the crowd gasped, Folashade rose and announced that the foundation would file a formal complaint for bribery and coercion, that the city would request an external auditor, that Balogun's partners would be named and pressed to account, and that the center would not bend to the old rules, but would insist on new rules that insisted on transparency, accountability, and community governance. The room answered with a roar that sounded like a river breaking a dam, and Akin felt a surge of something like relief and fear at once. Relief that a boy who had learned to survive by reading the signs of danger could now be part of a future where danger was met with a plan and a voice, and fear that the fight would never end, that the city's appetite for power would not vanish with a single public confession, and that the next round would be about keeping the promises in the daylight when the cameras were on, not just in the quiet of night when a girl whose fever had faded into memory could rest in a space she helped build. The midpoint of this stretch arrived with an almost ceremonial quiet that made the street feel newly honest. The old shacks, once pale with fear, now bore fresh coats of paint and a sunlit label reading Community Center, with a small library of donated books, a small clinic manned by a rotating team of volunteers, and a classroom where Akin students learned not merely to read, but to count the days they could live with dignity. The scent of charcoal stove and boiled rice warmed the courtyard, and the children ran in circles as Jeed chased a ball with a grin that stretched his cheeks to the edge of tears. Yet the quiet was deceptive, because in the far corner, Balogan's lawyer pressed for a quieter, more professional fight, claiming that the center's governance would require a statute, a white paper, and more signatures than a single night could supply, and that the city's plan must still pass through committees that could delay years of progress. So Folashade announced a parallel track. An independent council, half locals, half outside experts, would oversee the center's funds and ensure that every salary, every grant, every purchase remained visible to the people who walked past the stalls every morning and asked for justice in a soft voice. In that moment, a new ally stepped from the crowd, a former rival of Balogan, a respected local figure who had once spoken of order in a way that sounded like a threat, but now said on the record that order without equity was a cruelty, and equity without accountability was a lie. And he offered to serve as an overseer, not a magnate, someone who would remind the city that wealth is a means to serve, not an end to bend the weak to. And this promise stitched a new seam of hope into the center's fabric, a guarantee that the wealth gap would be acknowledged publicly and managed to narrow, not merely ignored as a background note. The closing beat of this cycle arrived in a motion that was both celebratory and sobering. The market's children gathered around the new classroom door, the first day's sun making their faces glow with a hopeful light, while Akin, who had once been called nothing but a shadow, stood with Jide on a crate and told the gathered crowd, "We built this not by asking for mercy, but by choosing to stand in the rain together." And Folashade, her voice tender beneath her usual steel, added, "We did not do this to own the story. We did this to own the future." And Balogan's lawyer, standing behind his boss's shoulder with the look of a man who believes a loss is not the end but the chance to rewrite the contract, felt the room tilt with a kind of public reckoning that could not be undone by a single apology. Even Sade, whose camera had once glinted like a knife in the sun, found herself cornered by a group of young reporters who coaxed her into admitting that she had edited to gain profit. And the audience's tone shifted from anger to instruction as she agreed to participate in an ethics workshop sponsored by the center, a gesture that would serve as restitution and as a warning. Truth must be unmasked, and those who use other people's pain for gain would answer to more than a judge's gavel. By the end of this leg of the journey, the old threat of demolition was replaced by a new ritual of protection. The land had a deed, the people had a voice, the children had a path, and the city had a precedent. And Akin realized that the interval's twist had not merely saved them from catastrophe, but reframed what it meant to be seen. Wealth would be measured not by a bank's numbers, but by the number of hands willing to lift another, the number of promises kept, the number of futures guaranteed. And as the day closed with the smell of palm oil simmering and the last photons slipping from his zinc roofs, a thread remained tethered to the next horizon. The center's ongoing work would test every day whether the city could turn its power into a shield rather than a blade, whether the hidden wealth behind Folashade's smile could be trusted to stay open to the community's weather, and whether Sade's former followers could learn to tell the truth with the same quiet courage with which Akin had learned to hand his cup to a stranger. And with that fragile, gleaming thread, the promise that kindness would be repaid with justice and that justice, once earned, would grow into more kindness, the scene closed on a night that promised rain and a future that might finally become a story the city would tell together, not alone. And the interval markers hummed softly, waiting for the next breath of courage to cross the market's edge and re-begin the life that had begun in a bus in the heat and the dust of Ajagundle.